So many screens open here. Sorry, Nick. Well, good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. Good morning for people who are in my time zone, or good evening if you're somewhere else. I'm Tom Weiss. I teach politics at the Graduate Center when I'm in New York. And I'm the Director Emeritus of the Bunch Institute, which is one of the sponsors, along with the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, of today's launch and conversation about global responses to displacement. I don't usually say this, but it is a pleasure because in fact, we have two friends and colleagues who are putting their books on the table, Nick Micinski and Simon Adams, and our guest commentator, Rana Khoury. Before introducing them, let me just say a brief word about the books in which these two books appear. It's a series at Routledge that I edit with a colleague, Roden Wilkinson. It's called Global Institutions. And Nick's and Simon's books are the most recent of almost 200 titles that appear in this series over the last 15 years. The word institution is used in the widest sociological sense, actually. There are volumes on single organizations with brick and mortar, the OECD or NATO or the ICC, as well as on regimes, environmental or international judicial pursuit. And the books are written by people at the outset of their careers or who are considerably longer in the tooth. That's not Simon, but it includes people like me and even a couple of people who were my mentors. There is a discount flyer that we'll refer to later for both books in case you're interested. I have to say, as the series editor, I'm delighted to have these two books in it. They're distinct, they're new, they're fresh. Today's format is simple. Only the speaker should have his or her mic on, which means that those of you in the audience should not. I'm going to briefly introduce Nick, and he's going to speak for 9 or 10 minutes. I'll introduce Simon, he'll do the same, and then I'll turn the floor over to Rana, who will kick off the conversation and engage Nick and Simon and parts of the audience as well. So let's begin with Nick, who, as you know, will speak about UN Global Compacts, the two compacts on refugees and migrants that have been discussed forever, it seems, at the UN in New York. Nick has the singular distinction of having survived me as both his dissertation advisor and as in 2 seminars. He was also a staff member at the Bunch Institute and worked on this book series when he was a graduate student. He's currently at the Université Laval and visiting researcher at the Center for the Study of Europe at Boston University. This fall, Nick begins a new adventure as the assistant professor in political science and international affairs at the University of Maine. Nick also has another book in press at the University of Michigan, Delegating Responsibility, International Cooperation on Migration in the European Union. As you will see, he brings to bear a passion for the topic, which began actually with his work with an NGO in London, working on refugees, which is where I first met him in a real and not a virtual pub. So Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tom. And thank you everyone for coming today. And thank you to Simon, the Ralph Bunche Institute, and Rana for being our discussant today. We really appreciate everyone coming. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my book and oriented around the topic of today, the global responses for displacement. The book is a result of several years of fieldwork and research on migrants and refugees at the UN. I was conducting interviews in Greece and Italy in 2016, attended the summit, the UN summit where the UN declaration was adopted, and interviewed key stakeholders throughout the 2 years of negotiations for the Global Compact. The result is this book, which analyzes the actual content. So if you want to know what's in the declarations or the compacts, you should read the book. It also explains the politics behind how we got to them. The main finding in the book, in case you want to cut to the gist, is that the global compacts are the result of 3 shifts in global politics. First, from hard law to soft law. Second, from rights to aid. And third, from Cold War politics to the nationalism of today. And I also identify in the book 5 fundamental challenges to global governance of migration. These are the lack of capacity, lack of responsibility sharing, lack of access to protection, lack of citizenship, and lack of coordination. And the global compacts actually only address one of those areas, the lack of coordination. So the topic of our discussion today, as I said, is the global responses to displacement. I consider the global compacts the most recent and comprehensive global response to displacement. Of course, there are many others. As Simon will talk about later, he specializes on the responsibility to protect, which is sort of a non-traditional response to displacement. But we can also go way back to the 1951 Refugee Convention for another good example of global responses to displacement. I address a few of these responses in my book in a chapter on the history of global governance of migration. These could be the Global Migration Group, the Global Forum on Migration Development, and the Sustainable Development Goals. But all of those are less global, less recent, or less focused on displacement. So what are the global compacts? There are 2 separate agreements. One is on refugees, the other is for migration. They're non-binding cooperative frameworks, which means that they technically call themselves non-legally binding. They were UN General Assembly resolutions. And we consider these soft law, which means that they aren't interpreted or applied in domestic legislation, but they can be interpreted by courts and be part of customary international law. The second thing is that the global compacts bundle and reaffirm rights. They reaffirm rights of migrants and refugees from lots of different documents and put them all in 1 or 2 authoritative documents. It raises the profile. There's lots of momentum in 2018 around this. And they issue link across diverse policy areas. So we bring in things like development and displacement all into 1 document. The third, and I think one of the most important contributions of the compacts, is that it builds an architecture for global migration governance. These are the new and regular spaces for states and civil society to meet, to decide on migration issues in the future. So over the next few decades, these will be the spaces in which we decide the key issues of how to govern migration. It's also a space for socializing states into fully embracing the norms and principles that are laid out in the compact. They will again and again be learning, be influenced by civil society, and hopefully adopt more of these practices. I'm going to focus the rest of my talk today about the Refugee Compact, but the Migration Compact was also a landmark agreement for many reasons, not least that it was the first truly global international agreement on all aspects of migration. And it included for the first time issues like climate change migration and a state responsibility for safe migration. So to zoom in on Zoom in the Global Compacts of Migration, Global Compact on Refugees. There are 3 key responses. I'm going to go quickly through these because they're a little bit detailed. The first is the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. That's the CRRF. This was included in the New York Declaration before, but it was rolled into the other compacts. It's modeled on sort of UNHCR's previous experiences with comprehensive responses with Indo-Chinese, after the Soviet Union, the Kosovo, or even more recently, the Syrian refugee response. The CRRF parallels the 3RP. You know, UN loves acronyms, so sorry about that. This is the Refugee Response Resilience Plan, which was launched in 2014. And the idea is to get as many states on board as possible to mobilize funding and resources and secure sort of a safe reception and protection while facilitating some sort of burden sharing. Now, the CRRF is intended to be more systematic and sustainable rather than a typical ad hoc, underfunded humanitarian responses to refugee crisis. The CRRF reads like a checklist of what to do in order. First, establish reception processes. Second, fundraise from donors based on a needs assessment. Third, incorporate those responses into a national development plan. And fourth, advocate for durable solutions. One of the problems, though, with this is that there are no criteria for triggering the CRRF, and there are no guarantees that there will ever be adequate protection and funding, which means that negotiations for burden sharing will still occur with each new crisis. The second area that is innovative in the global compacts is to create a global refugee forum. The first one was held in December 2019, and it will happen every 4 years. The idea here is that states will announce pledges every time at this big international conference, things like financial, material, or technical assistance, or specific numbers of placements for resettlement or complementary pathways. Other states may pledge to do major reforms of major domestic legislation governing refugees. And the forum is supposed to be a space for stock taking, reflecting on how far states have progressed along a set of 15 indicators. Now, all of these pledges are voluntary and non-binding, so it's unclear if the pledges will actually meet the needs or if they'll equitably share a burden. And there are also no enforcement mechanisms here. The third area is a new institution within UNHCR called the Asylum Capacity Support Group, which aims to have peer-to-peer support, helping to improve national asylum systems. Of course, states have to request this from UNHCR. They will have an initial assessment trying to decide what kind of capacities they need to build up, put it in a national plan. And then UNHCR hopes to match two states, the donor state or the expert state, with the state that needs their capacity built and help them do the capacity building. For example, they could help them draft new legislation, train staff, or establish like an oversight committee. And significantly, the compact actually calls for UNHCR to develop standing capacity to support states with this technical and human resources. Now, this is totally new. While the details have not yet been finalized, UNHCR proposes maintaining a roster of standby experts for different technical areas. UNHCR could also have emergency staff and training materials ready for quick deployment. However, this group, the Asylum Capacity Support Group, is not operational today, and we don't really know how states are going to adopt it. I'm going to conclude now just with 4 trends that I think are emerging within this global compacts about how we're responding to displacement in the global compacts. The first is that it's needs-based. The Global Refugee Forum rallies funding from donor countries for each refugee crisis. They're non-binding with no enforcement mechanisms, and it doesn't set out new rights like the 1951 Refugee Convention, but leaves an ominous silence, particularly on the principle of non-refoulement. The compacts defined a much broader need, the needs-based. It says that it's not just for refugees, but also for those who are displaced and for the host community. So an emphasis on host community. The second trend there is an ad hoc and voluntary pledges. Here, states pledge what they're willing, but as we've seen over the last few years, donations are never enough. They're slow to materialize, and they diminish over time. President Obama tried this pressure campaign. He did a pressure campaign through a separate leaders summit in 2016, but it's unclear if those pledges actually materialize and if they follow up in the long run. The third idea is that there's more coordination, and there are lots of coordination mechanisms in the compacts, and more coordination is a good thing, but more coordination does not necessarily mean better coordination. There's often overlapping coordination mechanisms, and actors compete for power within those mechanisms. Each new displacement crisis means that negotiations over the terms of the CRRF will have to be repeated. And there's no formula or requirement for burden sharing. So states come to the table with only what they're volunteering to offer. The last thing is that the compacts propose a response to build the capacity of states, not an international intervention by other states. UNHCR, they will lead the asylum capacity building group, but they have to have permission from the state to actually help them. So they're invited in. Just in conclusion, the global compacts are landmark international agreements, both because their content and that they exist at all. Much of this book that I wrote describes the negotiations that happen with the backdrop of anti-immigration policies of Trump or other European populist leaders. The compacts created this new architecture of global governance of migration. But there are many decisions still to be decided over the next 20 years or more in these spaces. Fundamentally, the compacts are a shift from hard law to soft law and from human rights to humanitarian aid. And we see that in the Refugee Compact that calls for voluntary pledges, not mandatory burden sharing, and needs-based, not rights-based approach to displacement. The compacts bring more coordination and capacity building, but we have yet to see the impact of these resources and the actual responses to displacement around the world. I'm going to leave it there, but thank you so much again from everyone to attending. And if you're looking to buy the book, please check the chat section over here.
Thanks, Nick. I see the Micinski family is there, but undoubtedly you've already given them a free copy, but they can purchase some more too.
Absolutely.
I think my mother was the only owner of my first book. So anyway, let's move on. I hope that during the conversation, Rana will push you to ask that famous question, so what? You really laid out a whole series of important apparent agreements to do something and whether or not that makes a difference. Let's move on to Simon Adams, who is the executive director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, not just migration, but looking at mass atrocities and whether we can do anything about them. The Global Center is based at the Bunch Institute, which was also the location for the research directorate of the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty that launched the notion of the responsibility to protect. The Global Center works in a host of ways around the world to prevent mass atrocities. These are not run-of-the-mill garden variety of human rights abuses, but genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. Their work circles around the Security Council and Human Rights Council, but lots of other people are involved as well. Simon has written books over the years on armed conflict, but today he's going to focus on his personal take on mass atrocities, the responsibility to protect, and the future of human rights. If not now, when, he asks. I hope he has an answer to that question. The mixture of personal experiences and his own work and the work of the center is a remarkable mix. And he's going to tell us whether never again is more than a slogan. Simon.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks to Nick. I should make sure that I observe protocol, and thank you to the Ralph Bunche Institute, to Routledge, and of course to the Comandante en Jefe, Tom Weiss, without whom I must say this book wouldn't exist. He certainly encouraged me along the way and helped make it possible. And I also just want to mention, I noticed in the list of people who are here online that Alan Rock, the former Attorney General of Canada, is actually online, and Alan played a huge and important role both in around global migration and refugee issues, but also around the development of the responsibility to protect. So I think the first question for any author is, why bother writing this book? And I think, in my particular case, I would like to think that there were two reasons. One is that, as I think Tom just intimated, that at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, where I have the honor of working, we have this kind of unique perch. We're kind of on the margins of the UN Security Council, of the Human Rights Council. We get to work very closely with states and with international civil society. And so we see how, I think as they say in this country, how the sausage is made behind the factory doors. And I think the second reason was why I decided to write this book was really, at a time when 80.2 million people in the world are displaced by persecution, by conflict, and by atrocities. I think it seems like a very good idea to assess what's working and what isn't and why. And, I kind of set that out at the start of this book. I have a copy here, where I think the opening is actually called, it wasn't supposed to be this way. And it kind of talks about my own personal frustration in 2017 when myself and a staff member of mine, who I think is also online, Nadira Court, we're briefing members of the UN Security Council about the genocide that was underway at that point in Rakhine State in Myanmar. And the absolute frustration I think all of us felt by the failure of the Security Council to do anything during that genocide. They certainly to this day have not ever passed a single binding resolution about the Rohingya genocide. And so the book is really about, I guess, R2P and about all human rights norms and laws. I think it was Australia's former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans who said that the whole point of kind of the development of this idea of the responsibility to protect was, and I'll quote him, was to create a new norm of international behavior which states would feel ashamed to violate, compelled to observe, or at least embarrassed to ignore. And I think, so much of the last decade and a half has been about trying to make them feel ashamed, trying to compel them to observe, and trying to at least making them embarrassed to ignore it. Because I think even before COVID-19, we were already in a situation where we were in the midst of a kind of human rights recession. We're living through an era where human rights defenders are under attack in so many places around the world, when authoritarianism and toxic nationalism are on the rise, xenophobia, anti-refugee sentiment has become mainstream in many countries, and when multilateralism and the UN system are under attack. And so again, to go back to that opening point, I think the 2017 Myanmar crisis / genocide was not just a failure of the Security Council to uphold its responsibility to protect. It was a failure to challenge the calculus of lowest common denominator diplomacy and to stand up for the basic norms and laws and principles of human rights and humanitarianism. And so I think my book is really an assessment of the last 15 years of R2P, rolling through all the major crises of our times, whether it be Libya, Syria, Myanmar, Yemen, assessing what's gone wrong, what's gone right, and why, but also trying to look at emerging issues as well. So for example, how climate change has affected human rights and atrocities in the world and become a threat multiplier for both. Looking at terrorism and how that intersects with not only with atrocities, but for example, with attacks on cultural heritage taking place in the world. I guess what I'm trying to say basically is that there's something for everyone in this book, folks, and encouraging you to get it. And I think, the issue of refugees is absolutely central to my argument, and certainly was at the forefront of my thinking when I wrote the book. Before these COVID times, I would travel a lot for work, and I was often in Europe over that summer of 2015 when the refugee crisis from Syria absolutely hit the European continent. And it seemed like every train station, every airport, every road you went down, major road, arterial road through Europe was clogged with refugees. I think that crisis, as it was called at the time, was a direct result and a direct consequence, again, of an international failure to uphold collective responsibilities around preventing conflict, around halting atrocities, and so forth. So, the book is really poses a question, I guess, of what should we do when the international system, which was built in the aftermath of World War II, is no longer fit for purpose, when it seems more and more to a number of people around the world as a sort of typewriter operating in an iPhone and laptop world. And the book does provide some recommendations. I don't want to give away the ending, but it does provide recommendations for what states should do in terms of how to deal with the dysfunction and the division at the UN Security Council. It talks about the kind of experience that I've had and others have had working with the UN Security Council and the Human Rights Council. Because if that experience has taught me anything, it's that we don't lack early warning about situations where mass atrocity crimes are threatened or where massive refugee flows are about to happen. What we lack is timely and decisive action by the international and consistent action by the international community. So, my book sort of ends with those policy suggestions about what various parts of the international system can and should do, the UN, states, parliaments, and so forth. But it also focuses very much on individual responsibility and what's possible when people act, even in situations that can seem completely hopeless. Because, I wanted to really underline the point that not only that small, ordinary people like ourselves can make big differences in their own lives and the lives of other people when they decide to take action, but that it's all about individual responsibility. And I think that one of the scarcest resources of contemporary international politics is intestinal fortitude, for want of a better term. We need more leaders with political courage. And, I talk about the case of Abubakar Ba Tamandu, the former Minister of Justice of the Gambia, who I've been very lucky to work with over the last couple of years. And, he comes from the smallest country on the African continent, not a country that anybody thinks of being a political powerhouse or a bastion of international law. And yet it was his personal experience visiting Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh that inspired him to do what the UN Security Council and 192 other UN member states had failed to do, which is that he decided that there must be a way to hold the regime in Myanmar accountable for what they had done to the Rohingya. He was the one who made a decision to investigate the possibility of bringing a case at the International Court of Justice for breaching the Genocide Convention. And then he did so. And that historic case is still ongoing. But I think it shows that, in a world in which kind of indifference and inaction still predominate, individuals, in this case, an individual happened to have an important governmental position, but that all of us can make a difference. So let me just say this as the final word. I don't know exactly how long I've been speaking for, but long enough, clearly. Let me just say this as the final thing. I think a lot of politicians in the world in which we live today talk about human rights, talk about refugees, talk about activism, and talk about idealism like these are all dirty words. But I think that the point I tried to make in the book and using historical examples is that I think that determined political action and focused idealism is the only thing that has ever changed the world and is the only thing that moves society in particular ways. No one said this was going to be easy, and my book doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but I hope it provides some fresh perspective and encourages our readers somewhere to get up and join the struggle, because we have a world to win.
Well, thanks, Simon, for ending on a bit of a positive note. Those of us who are in this business sometimes forget that fact, because clearly, well, at the center's website, you traced how discourse has changed. Security Council referred to R2P 84, 85 times, the Human Rights Council another 50 times. And so the same question I sometimes ask Nick, that so what? Are we closer? We're closer rhetorically to never again, but are we closer actually to implementing that is something more than a slogan? Well, Rana Khoury is now going to take over as traffic cop. She is a candidate in political science at Northwestern University and is about to begin a postdoctoral assignment at Princeton at the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance. She's actually very nicely placed to kick off this conversation because her own current work examines the impact of outside involvement, international insistence on civilian and refugees activism in that seemingly endless blight on the humanitarian conscience, Syria. Rana, floor is all yours. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the Ralph Bunche Institute for hosting this event and for making me a part of it. I have shared, and I will share again here in the chat, links to the books and the discount code you can use to get them. I highly recommend. And I will begin with some remarks of my own, and I will facilitate a conversation with Nick and Simon and Thomas, and also open to questions from the audience using the chat or using the little hand raising emoji in Zoom for us to call on you. Okay, so an average of 24 people were displaced from their homes every minute of every day in 2015. Syrians left home more than anyone else, fleeing from one of the most brutal conflicts of our lifetimes. In the years since the conflict had begun as a protest movement in 2011, many Syrians asked pleadingly, where is the international community? The two books that we are launching today provide some important answers to that loaded perennial question. Nick Micinski's work carefully documents and analyzes actions taken and not taken by global governors to the perceived refugee crisis in Europe at that moment, and to the generalized growth of migrant and displaced populations since the 1990s. Micinski, out of these efforts, he shows us these two global compacts that emerged for refugees and migrants. He explains the commonalities and contrasts in these compacts and identifies underlying trends in world politics that characterize them. The book comes together as a political history of a very recent and critical moment in global governance. Simon Adams's book on mass atrocities and the responsibility to protect addresses the politics that global migration and refugee governors often and in vain try to avoid. This work is one of documentation, advocacy, memoir, and forecast. It vividly illustrates the dynamics of numerous crises and analyzes global responses to them from the perspective of an insider with access to delicate diplomatic conversations and contacts in conflict zones around the world. The value of both books is already enduring. As we witness the plight of people fleeing north from Central America in search of dignity and safety, through Micinski's work, we can grapple with the border control systems that they are up against that were essentially endorsed by the Migration Compact, and their legal status, which was a non-starter for the Refugee Compact. Adams documents a pattern whereby international inaction emboldens repressors to behave more severely, commit more crime. His analysis of the persecution and displacement of Myanmar's Rohingya community portends an emboldened ruling regime that is, as we speak, taking cues from past international inaction. I commend both authors on these important contributions. There are a couple of areas that I would wish to better grapple with that came out of their reading. While reading Nick's, I thought of the states that have hosted most Syrian refugees, Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, and wondered how global responses to each relate to the compacts. Would I be right to see, for instance, the Jordan Compact in its push for refugee self-reliance and development aid for host communities mirrored in the Global Compact? And if so, was Syrians' displacement experience a test of the compact or an inspiration for it? While reading Adams, I wondered about the role of the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in contributing to skepticism of the responsibility to protect. I take as valid the positions that neither war was quite an enactment of R2P and that post hoc humanitarian justifications do not make them such. But I nevertheless think our concepts and typologies can take life and real world processes in ways we must grapple with. I also saw what I think is a critical thread that implicitly ties both works together: the expansion of international aid generally and humanitarianism particularly. Since the end of the Cold War, international organizations have undergone bureaucratization and rationalization. These are evident in the global migration and refugee compacts focus on the creation of more coordination mechanisms to increase efficiency and effectiveness. They're focused on establishing indicators and collecting data, and the proliferation of forums, platforms, meetings, groups. One wonders what these measures might take away from. One of the darker sides of bureaucratization, in my view, is the sapping of energy dedicated toward other ends. Assuming all these people and agencies and stakeholders were already busy, what might they do less of to do more toward the bureaucratic ends of the compacts? Humanitarianism's growth has not just been in institutional complexity, but also in funding, which has increased remarkably since the 1990s. Adams, in his book, points to the humanitarian and developmental tolls of inaction on mass atrocities. He is clear that the moral and humanistic imperatives should be reason enough to act, but he makes the additional case for those that may need it that efforts to reduce violence make good economic sense too. But arguably, powerful states have been far more willing to invest in humanitarian aid than in the hard political work of resolving conflicts. We saw this in Syria, where Adams documented the US's wavering and passive stance to militarily protect Syrian citizens, where it was also consistently and by far the largest donor to the humanitarian response. So this feeds right into Nick's identification of the move from rights to aid, from people in need of protection to people in need. So where I see this convergence in both books, I also see some tensions, and I will focus my few questions on these for a conversation. I will then open to questions from the audience, which again, I asked to put in the chat or to raise the hand emoji. So my first question to both of you is how the same Syrian crisis seemingly spurred international action on migration and displacement, but the same crisis subdued international action on R2P. Relatedly, I saw in Nick's book the quotidian work that gets done toward norm emergence. And I saw in Simon's book these portendings of a norm slowly slipping away. And I wonder how you can think of those in relation to the same crisis.
Nick?
Well, these are amazing comments. I want to thank you straight away for really engaging with the work on the deep level. I mean, there's lots of like documentation going on here, lots of that, but like getting to the heart of some of these questions, I don't know if I got to as many deep moments before Rana brought these up. This first question, Syria spurs action on the migration side, but not on R2P. It is absolutely the case that the global compacts are inspired by Syrians moving towards Europe, right? There's a lot of post hoc justification that the refugees are a global problem. We've been doing it this way, but it wasn't until they moved towards Europe that Europe and the rest of the world took notice and made it a priority, right? It couldn't have happened with, which I document in the book, like there were years, decades of building up to the global compacts, but that onus of an international agreement and moving all the pieces in place was exactly that. I will say the reason it spurred action on the refugee compact side is that it's a voluntary, needs-based development, non-mandatory approach. I think the most telling example is that the Secretary General said, we need to have a compact, a global compact on the responsibility sharing for refugees. That was the title that it was supposed to be. By the time the negotiations were done, responsibility sharing disappeared from its title. Okay, you see it just right there. The negotiations took out the teeth of the compact. Even though we know that they were never going to be mandatory, it was never going to be hard law with quotas or anything like that. It took out the main purpose of this, that it was supposed to be burden sharing, responsibility sharing. And we can't address these crises without having everyone buy in, right? So I think that's why it was totally appealing to people, because voluntary is great. Let's sign up for this. There's action and movement that can happen there. And it's the same calculation that Obama made during the 2016. I mean, this is a similar moment where he said, okay, we're not going to try for a huge UN agreement. We're going to try for something, the Leaders Summit, which was just a day or two before, after, I can't remember, the UN New York Summit. and it was trying to pressure or bully people to do more pledges. Now, it's been 5 years later. That was not the approach. It's totally disappeared, and all those pledges, who knows if they actually turned up, right? So that is why I think the crisis has, or the Syrian displacement spurred action on the migration side. I'll leave it to Simon to talk a little bit about the R2P side, and then let's come back to the norm emergence, because I think that's a really important question of itself.
Yeah, thanks, Rana, and thanks, Nick. I mean, I think there's a danger sometimes that we read too much into any single case. I think each case is simply its own case, which I know sounds like a little bit of a almost like an academic cop-out, but I happen to think that it's true. So I think, in the Syrian case, there's no doubt that Libya had an impact, keeping in mind that they were happening at around about the same time. But to maybe speak to that point about every case is important. So there's a tendency to politically invest everything in any single case. So we go, okay, Libya. The lesson of Libya is that intervention, especially military intervention, is bad. Okay, but then we have Syria. The lesson of Syria is that the lack of intervention and inaction and indifference is bad, and that it leads to disasters. But there's a third conflict, which nobody talks about, which happened at almost exactly the same time. And that is the situation in Cote d'Ivoire, where literally in the same week that resolutions were being passed about Libya, there were resolutions passed in keeping with the responsibility to protect, to stop atrocities in Cote d'Ivoire. Not a country that people pay that much attention to or care that much about, and maybe that's part of the reason why it didn't get that much attention. But comparatively speaking, it was successful. It stopped atrocities from happening there. It led to a transition to the democratically elected government, and the dictator who was resisting that transition was actually arrested and ended up being sent to the International Criminal Court, where he was found not guilty, by the way. But it led to a pretty successful attempt to end atrocities. So again, I just think it's a warning of that we can't invest too much in any one case. We need to learn from all of them, because each case is different, and the tools that we use, tools in one case may be completely inappropriate for another case. So that's the first thing.
Can I jump in there, Simon? I think this is I agree with you on the single cases. Like, that's, I think, absolutely what's happening. The other thing, though, is that in the Syrian case, the politics of it were so hard to get around that in at least the migration and refugee compacts, it was a way of sidestepping the politics that they couldn't solve, right? By instead of engaging in the high politics of the Security Council and trying to work out some sort of agreement, which probably couldn't have happened, they found another route, which was coordination of aid actors, pour more money in, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the Ivory Coast, the answer is that the politics wasn't as complicated in the Security Council.
100%. And I think that seems to be the default setting for much of what passes for global diplomacy these days, is that states would rather spend money on, bandages and bags of rice in order to deal with the consequences of the failure to prevent, the failure to stop conflicts from getting worse and metastasizing, than they would in actually taking difficult political decisions to stand up and to, call out states who are acting in particular ways, or God forbid, actually take action. And I'm not just talking here about military action. Military action should always be a last resort. I'm talking just the simple work of hard preventative work of exposing abuses and taking action in response to those abuses. And I think that in Syria, the politics were very complicated. They were always going to be complicated, and it was always going to be an incredibly, incredibly difficult case. But it's also a deeply contradictory case, because we see in Syria, and this is the other part of the question that I wanted to address that you asked, Rana, that we see that states did take bilateral action, like a huge number of states, imposed sanctions on the Syrian regime, criticized it in the UN General Assembly and other sorts of places, took all kinds of action to try and censor censure what the Syrian regime was doing. But that was also combined with the fact that you had 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council who were determined to veto 16 times to stop international diplomatic action taking place inside the UN Security Council, including blocking international diplomatic action around things as simple as chemical weapons are clearly being used. We think that should be investigated and the perpetrators held accountable. The Russians vetoed that. They stopped that from going through. So I think the net effect of that was to not only erode people's confidence in the utility of the UN Security Council, you can see that most powerfully in the kind of growing movement calling for veto reform, calling for states to commit to veto restraint or for the actual abolition of the veto. And something that, like, for example, the Global Center had raised as on our wish list of things that should be done. Suddenly, because of this kind of long chain of vetoes blocking any kind of reasonable diplomatic action and accountability, suddenly you see, a code of conduct emerges via Liechtenstein at the UN General Assembly. 116, I think it is, states have now signed up to that code of conduct, and there's more pressure, I think, than ever before to say that, well, if the UN Security Council is so dysfunctional, so broken, and so divided, then we need to look at other ways of creating more effective tools in international diplomacy.
I want to give you both the opportunity. So we've talked about this past large conflict. I want to give you the opportunity to look forward a little bit. And both of your books touched importantly on climate change and what it portends for how we deal with displacement and migration, as well as with conflicts and the responsibility to protect. And at the same time, both books also gave this suggestion that sovereignty is hardened. These conceptions of absolute sovereignty of states is hardening. So how do we go forward on climate change with this simultaneous hardening of sovereignty?
I don't know if you want to go first, Nick, or you want me?
You go first this time.
Okay, well, I mean, in some ways, I think it's analogous in the humanitarian sphere, which is that, again, I think, unfortunately, most states would rather deal with the humanitarian consequences of climate change, even though those are getting bigger and are only going to grow over time, than they would dealing with the tough political decisions that need to be made now in order to stop climate change. And I'll give you a very, I think, a very good illustration, which is how, if you don't understand the conflict, human rights, and atrocity prevention part of the equation, you're missing the problem. So, there's a growing problem in parts of Nigeria and neighboring states with Fulani herdsmen coming further south than they ever have before and moving into areas, and Fulani herdsmen are predominantly Muslim, and moving into areas that are settled farming communities that are predominantly Christian, and there being violence between these communities. This violence, by the way, has literally killed thousands of people in Nigeria and in neighboring countries over the last couple of years. And so how does the world read that violence? It reads it as Muslim versus Christian violence, as, kind of migratory peoples versus settled farming community violence, ethnic violence, through that prism. What's neglected from that is the reason why the Fulani herdsmen are coming further south than they ever had before in history, which is desertification and climate change. It's absolutely altered the environment on the Lake Chad Basin, which is why people are migrating further south than ever before. So if you only look at the symptom, you're not dealing with the much bigger problem. The atrocities are kind of a symptom of a much bigger issue of desertification, climate change that needs to be dealt with in order to deal with the situation. So I think that's just one example where, this is the existential crisis of our times that cannot just be dealt with by hoping that if we just invest in, to use the words I used before, if we just invest in enough bags of rice, or, we medevac people off Pacific Islands that are going underwater, that's the best that we can do. It requires big thinking and big political solutions.
I will echo a lot of what Simon just said. I'm very passionate about climate change migrations. This is one of the issues that the compact actually is quite progressive on, right? The Global Compact on Migration includes environmental displacement, includes climate change migration, sudden onset and slow onset disasters. This is the first time in an international agreement on migration that these are recognized in this way, right? Which I think is really important. What it doesn't do is give us real commitments on any of it, which is clear. This is a soft law. I think when we think about climate change, the UN climate summits are actually a really important space to help the refugee regime actually grow. The idea of common and differentiated responsibilities is embedded and actually agreed by all states that pollute more actually have more responsibility in the climate regime. Well, that is something that we could learn from in the refugee and migration regime. States that are more responsible for displacement should be more responsible for helping support the burden, right? And that has many knock-on effects that are hard to pull out, but there are knock-on effects. The other thing I wanted to highlight here is the needs-based versus rights-based approach. And how do we address that in a climate change, migration, or climate displacement scenario? The Global Compact on Migration clearly says that we should approach climate migration through climate adaptation by preventing climate change, preventing displacement from the beginning, right? So provide aid to host communities to adapt to, so they don't ever have to leave. That is a needs-based approach. It's not a rights-based approach, right? A rights-based approach would say people who are forcibly displaced because of climate would need to have their rights protected, such as not being forcibly deported back to your country if there's still a climate disaster happening there. Right now, there's no protection for that. It could potentially be part of a principle of non-refoulement, but it's not really explicitly put anywhere. There are a few test cases in courts right now where a man who's in France is supposedly prevented from being deported back to Bangladesh because of air pollution. He has a lung disease. So in that case, they prevented it. So that's one case out of what could be millions that could be protected through non-refoulement. The last thing, which I think hits on Rena's really important point here, is that sovereignty and climate change are really in tension, right? I mean, how do we go about addressing this huge climate issue without making everyone buy into this? And the Global Compacts, actually, the answer is kind of disappointing. The answer is that we should build the capacity of states to address this, right? And that's why there are lots of capacity building mechanisms. That's why they want to throw aid at the problem. It's not about making it a rights-based or a mandatory burden sharing thing. It's that we'll pour money into capacity building. What I think is optimistic there is it actually fits into the cycle of R2P. R2P actually has a prevent part of it that is before a climate a conflict happens, displacement happens, that we should try to build up a state so that these sorts of things don't happen. And that can be through capacity building. Let's have those types of interventions that are not military, but are sort of a humanitarian or state capacity in nature earlier on so that displacement doesn't happen to begin with.
I appreciate the way that you tied that together. I want to open to Akash, but I think, yes, Akash, I think you have a question. You have your hand raised.
I do. Thank you so much. Forgive me for not being on by video. And of course, thank you for your moderation. And thank you to both authors for their thoughtful perspectives. If you both could forgive me for being a bit pedestrian, I'd love to know what surprised you both most in the course of doing the research and writing your books. And I'd also love to know a bit separately, what is one of the many things I would imagine that you'd want policymakers to bear in mind as what I fear they navigate these type of challenges more and more in the years and decades ahead?
Sure, I'm happy to tell you what I was surprised at. So, and what you might be surprised at. Even though the compacts were framed as controversial, right? Controversial that we have a international agreement on migration that states are signing on. And Trump pulled out at the very beginning, sort of using it as a talking point that we shouldn't sign an international agreement that's going to violate our sovereignty. And European countries, several governments in Europe actually collapsed over the compact. And this was controversial near the end. What is surprising is that the content of it is not controversial at all. And this is standard run-of-the-mill migration management principles, that you should check someone's passport at the border, that you should provide medical aid if they're ill, right? These are very, very standard. One of the things that I was surprised at didn't happen more in the negotiations is that states agreed together to restrict migration or organize migration in a way that would be restrictive, right? There's agreement across most states that they should be allowed to have tools like building walls or monitoring people through biometrics, through databases. This is all an agreement. Maybe as a human rights activist, you wouldn't like that, but states have remarkable agreement on this. And I think that is what's surprising. And I think Rana sort of alluded to this in one of her questions, that there is a norm emerging that I'm trying to identify of state responsibility for safe migration. This isn't a right to let someone come to your country. It's that states have agreed that we should be making migration safer, inevitably also letting them restrict migration, right? Clamp down on border enforcement, make sort of endorsement of those restrictionist policies, which is surprising in some ways. I'll leave it there. Simon, I'll hand over to you.
I mean,
fascinating.
Two things. I mean, and the thing that surprised me, I guess, was, you know, I kind of was working on this book, and then I got COVID-19 last March from my health worker wife. So the thing that surprised me was finishing it and using the quarantine to have this as a good focus to get out of bed and recover and to work on the book, and then actually getting it out there into the world. In terms of what I think the other part of it was sort of like, what's the lesson, or what's the thing you'd like to, you know, states or whatever to take away from it. Again, I just go back to maybe to that story that I mentioned about the justice minister from Bartambadu from the Gambia, because that, you know, the backstory to that is that ourselves and our colleagues at the Global Justice Center made a list of all 193 members of the UN and said who would potentially take a case to the International Court of Justice for breaching the Genocide Convention. And we went through state by state, all the big ones who make lots of wonderful, beautiful speeches about human rights. And everybody politely turned us down, one after another, over a period of about 18 months. And it took, again, as I mentioned, the smallest state on the African continent, a state that had literally just come out of military dictatorship itself and was going through a transition. And it took the courage of one person to say, okay, I'm going to be the one who's going to do it. And we're going to find a way to fund it. And we're going to find a way to politically make this happen. And what do I mention that? Because when the case, you know, the case started and provisional measures were handed down by the judges, which was a very positive thing. There was global media attention. And then in the aftermath of that, Canada and the Netherlands also joined the case to try and hold Myanmar accountable as well, which is something that I absolutely applaud. But again, I just think it's a lesson to every individual, to every single one of us, regardless of the work that we do, that, you know, it can seem very much like you're operating in the dark and that you're pushing, it's a labor of Sisyphus, for those of you in touch with your memory of Greek mythology, but that at the end of the day, it can help change things in really big and fundamental ways.
Thank you. Lambe? And sorry for mispronouncing names.
You know, you called it right. That's actually right. Well, thanks for this very, very insightful chat. I'm actually from Cameroon, and I'm based in Australia. And I must say I've been particularly very, very touched by the work which Simon does, and I have followed a couple of his stuff on Twitter. So my question for him, coming from a country where mass atrocities are ongoing and where there is a legit perception that it's a neglected conflict, based on your work and research, how much optimism have you observed in states adopting a progressive approach towards R2P? And what do you think would be, what can be the promise for victims of mass atrocities?
Yeah, no, look, thanks for the question. I 100% agree with you that Cameroon is one of the great neglected conflicts of our time. And it's convenient to neglect it. The African Union has shown very little interest. Foreign powers have shown very little interest. It's got very little attention at the UN Security Council, and it has now become a massive conflict and a massive crisis. And of course, it's become a displacement crisis as well, in keeping with the theme of this discussion and what Nick's book talks about as well, because it's not only spilled over into neighboring Nigeria, the displacement issue, but there's a massive internal displacement question. And, you know, it pains me enormously that it gets almost zero coverage in the international media. And most people, I think, unfortunately, in the world wouldn't even be aware that there's been a conflict ongoing in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon for the last couple of years, in which many people have been killed and in which entire villages have been burnt down and so forth. I don't know about the second part of your question. You know, my parents are Irish and my family comes from Northern Ireland, and maybe it's just the stubbornness in me. But, you know, we just never back away from these issues. Like, we will keep advocating on behalf of victims in Cameroon until there is justice. And I think that's true of all of the different situations that the Global Center works on. And I think that human rights people work on, is that after the TV cameras switch off, you know, if they do, in the case of Myanmar or any other country, we will still be here. We will still be plugging away. We will still be looking for whatever avenues there possibly are to find justice for victims and survivors of these atrocities, whether that be through the courts or in other kinds of ways as well. So I'm sorry for what's happening in your country, my friend. And I see that you've resettled in my adopted country as well, Australia. And so I hope Australia is treating you well, but rest assured that Cameroon still has plenty of friends out there in the world who will keep fighting for the rights of its people.
Well, we are coming up on the end of our meeting together, and maybe I will close off by just asking one more question that you can think about. And that is, it seemed to me when reading the books, there was different loci of action in each, with the Security Council much more at the center in Simon's book, and many more agencies and stakeholders in the General Assembly in Nick's book. And I wonder, how do we make sense of this? How do we overcome Security Council that is antiquated in its composition? And do we just try to move action elsewhere, as with seem to be more or less successful in Nick's book?
This is really, really important. I think there's a structural issue here about how decisions and actions are happening. And I'm glad that you highlighted the way in which the Security Council and the General Assembly are different in both of these. I mean, the negotiations were state-led in the both global compacts, and the decisions will always be state-led, even though civil society has bigger space in both the Global Refugee Forum and in other places for the migration governance. It's always state-led, right? But state-led can be in the General Assembly or in the Security Council. And technically R2P could be invoked by a General Assembly, but rarely has enough momentum for this sort of thing. I will say there's a question about if the compact's main way of interacting is capacity building through aid, right? Is this sidestepping the Security Council politics, right? Technically, the state has to invite the UN in to do that capacity building. So how can we actually prevent displacement if the state is the one creating the push factor for people to move, if the state's never going to invite them in? In some ways, it's a sidestep of the politics, but it doesn't solve the main problem of sovereignty and the question of how do we protect these people if the state isn't going to protect them? So my answer from the book is that we haven't solved the sovereignty question. In fact, both compacts could have had a much stronger refutation of absolute sovereignty and an affirmation of human rights and the universal protection of people's right to be alive, right? This is what we should be building UN action on, at least. But the compacts didn't do that. It was a different version of a sovereignty that they leaned towards.
Yeah, I was listening to Nick then, but then I was also looking at my own book to go, what did I say at the end? Because I was just double checking myself. Because I agree. And I think that, you know, even though the reality is we live in a world constructed of states, those states have power. International law is focused on the UN Security Council as the only body that has charged with the maintenance of international peace and security. We have regional organizations. But I think it's not an either-or question, or it shouldn't ever be viewed as an either-or question. And so, you know, what I tried to do in the final chapter of my book was, again, to follow up on what Nick was saying, is to place an emphasis on each of these parts of the equation are important. The UN Secretariat is important. The UN Security Council and Human Rights Council are important. Regional organizations are important. Individual states are important. Below that, parliaments are important. Parliaments can make a difference. Parliaments can raise issue and push things, even in situations where the government doesn't want to. And individuals are important. Individuals, regardless of whether they're part of those structures or not, just ordinary, you know, people, can make all the difference in the world.
I will take that opportunity to end on that somewhat hopeful note from Simon of empowering individuals and hopefully his readers. And I will put the links to the books and the discount code in the chat again. And if I can ask everyone to join me in thanking our authors and congratulating them on their books. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rana.
Yeah, thank you, Rana, and thank you everybody for coming along.
We'll be circulating the video after it's uploaded, and hopefully, if you have questions, please feel free to follow up via email as well.
Absolutely. Bye, everyone.